All right, welcome to today's webinar on mastering clinical trials for AI diagnostic devices. My name is Jaclyn Maney, and I am the moderator for today's event and also the marketing manager here at Rook Quality Systems. We have a really great presentation scheduled for you all today with two great presenters, Andrew Wu from Rook Quality Systems and Arthur Spalding from TAMM. Before we dive into the presentation and let our speakers introduce themselves, I'm just going to touch on a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and will conclude with a Q&A session at the end. I encourage you all to send any questions that you may have that come up during the presentation using the Q&A chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. In addition, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording, slide deck, session summary, and Q&A recap will be sent to you all via email later this afternoon. Now I'm going to pass it over to Arthur to briefly introduce himself before we dive into the meat of the presentation.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Anyway, my name is Arthur Spalding. I'm the president of TAMM. We are a boutique CRO based in Atlanta. So as such, we offer full regulatory services, clinical trial conduct, and also market access, including health economics. I look forward to hearing any questions you all have after the presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Wu, the VP Medical Software and General Manager of the APAC office at Rook Quality Systems. My background is in engineering, have done multiple startups in the past. Before I joined Rook, serving as an engineering manager at multiple firms. And I'd like to highlight that Rook Quality System has helped many of our clients secure AI-enabled SAMD clearances in the US, right, ranging from wearable devices to medical imaging post-processing applications, IV products, and a wide variety of products. We have also helped our US manufacturers, enter a dozen of APAC markets and help them manage their local suppliers on both the quality and regulatory front. Okay, next slide, please. Aside from regulatory submission support, we also help companies set up PMS as well as maintain post-market activities, which is going to be a very relevant topic today. We recently formed a dedicated task force to support both the AI ML front and the cybersecurity front as well. So please feel free to reach out anytime, and we'll be happy to chat with you guys and see if there's anything else that we can support. All right, so here's the agenda for today. First, we'd like to define what exactly is an AI diagnostic device, and just to give a few product examples as references for the audience today. And during the first half of the webinar, I'm going to talk about the VMV testing as the prerequisites before initiating a clinical trial for diagnostic devices with AI functions. And the most recent FDA guidance on the AI-enabled function pre-market submission requirement, this guidance would serve as a very important foundation for my part of the talk today. Then I will pass this presentation to Art to talk about the practical implementation of good clinical practices and how to prepare and initiate a clinical trial to ensure timely, effective executions. And we hope this presentation can be particularly helpful for a company who are putting together your VMV activity and clinical trial as part of a packet for submission evidence. So you can have a full package, a very adequate package to present in front of the FDA reviewers. Okay, so that would conclude the agenda run through. So next slide, please. Okay, so in the context of this presentation, we define AI diagnostic device as med devices which has software function that meets the definition of the device, first of all. And that software function implements one or more AI model to achieve its intended purpose, right? And the intended purpose is for diagnostic purposes, such as disease detection, triaging, or decision support that inform or drive clinical decision to an eventual diagnosis, right? So here are a few examples. And at a high level, we can categorize this device group into two. One is the IVD diagnostic devices, which very obvious. examine the specimen, including blood or tissue derived from the human body. An example of that is the IVD, AI-Diagnostic device that is a liquid biopsy test reader device, which detects circulating tumor DNA fragments using an ML algorithm to inform treatment decisions. Right, so that's one clear example from an IVD side for this type of devices. And the second cohort is the device which are not in vitro diagnostic devices, and those which acquire, process, analyze signal from signal acquisition systems or medical imaging from the scanners, for instance. An example of that is a medical imaging-based SAMD, which allow physician to detect large vessel occlusion from a NCCT scan to alert clinicians. Okay, so in a nutshell, AI model can be embedded and implemented in various forms, in various use cases. And that can, it would be integrated with many other device function that's not AI or even not a med device function by the FDA's definition. Right? So it is actually very important to provide a device description to support the FDA's understanding on how the AI function would be used in your device, right? And how the other non-AI function or even non-device function are interacted with your AI device. So that's really the first step for the FDA reviewer to understand how your device is behaving in front of different type of users, in between different type of clinical workflows that you're presenting indicated for use. Okay. Next slide, please. So let's dig into the common pitfalls for this type of AI-enabled devices, right? And how to avoid them. And I would just highlight a few areas that's very obvious to companies who are developing AI solutions. Right? So first, trained algorithm might perform differently across populations, and under different deployment sites, deployment conditions. And there are additional security consideration on the data, model, operating system that you need to care about. And this is going to be a part of the review constraint or boundary that you have to define for the FDA to feel confident about the safety efficacy of your solution. And that can be quite unique from the typical SDLC process governed by 62304. And the second pitfall typically surrounds the change management processes. Change management is necessary for AI-enabled devices to maintain their performance because the inference data distribution might be different from the training data distribution. So you might experience data drift, you might experience model degradation due to multiple other factors. And that is actually part of the reason why FDA and many other regulatory jurisdictions pushed out the predetermined change control plan, right? Because these sponsors, these medical device manufacturers who have AI solution in the market, that's, in a post-market stage, in the deployment state, they are experiencing this model shift or change over time, right? So they have to actively maintain the performance of their devices, and change management become a very hot topic because you don't want any regulatory process to be a burden for you to maintain certain performance of the algorithm, right? And lastly, trustworthiness of AI devices. AI device, they behave in some way that could not understood by human, right? We talked about deployment site differences and performance across deployment site differences. There might be some demographic information or some site-specific information that's being taken in by your AI model that influence the eventual output. But that was, that might not be the actual intent of the initial design, right? So be able to allow your user to interpret and explain the device output through validation, through model labeling, through product labeling. It's particularly important. And this is going to be we're going to emphasize this multiple times throughout this presentation with concrete examples, so you guys will understand, what I'm trying to emphasize here in the slide. Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. Right. So oftentimes we're told by regulators, right? Do risk-based activity, conduct risk management activities, right? And these would serve as the foundation for driving your product realization process. Obviously, no exception here, for AI diagnostic devices. And oftentimes we have to revisit risk management process numerous times to address the unique challenges that we talked about, right? Such as model output transparency, right? And you can have, certain designs such as heat map, quality measure metrics, to really inform the user about the behavior of your model, right? You have to demonstrate clinical relevancy to the specific clinical workflow. There might be different user who are using this output for different purposes. So you got to qualify their user of understanding your device, how to interact with your device in a way that's intended, right? So define risk control measure, right? Not let alone it's an inherent design decision, right? Or protection measure, such as a warning, of a model performance degradation, or even a labeling control, right? Based on the typical 14971 process, the 34971, which is a AI-specific risk management process that has been published about 2 years until now, and then cybersecurity, a TR57 guidance on risk management activity, right? So during the design input-output process, these risk management activity are actually crucial because you have to define those risk mitigation up front for you to be able to conduct a VMV confidently, right? So once the requirements are finalized, then we move on to VMV activities. So you conduct validation activity to ensure, right, your device will establish a relevant performance specification, and this can be consistently met, and as well as achieving its intended use in the specified clinical workflow, right? In the practical, scenario, there would be smaller scale external validation study or internal validation study, and oftentimes you use retrospective data set. And you would be conducting certain exploratory subgroup analysis and identify the scenarios where your device performed subpar, right? Worse than the overall performance. And you will be testing your entire software workflow from the system level as well, right? As we described earlier, the AI model interaction with other heuristic code base needs to be properly characterized and tested as well, right? So this VMV activity can be quite complex. And you can see that continuity, especially with the AI diagnostic devices, because upfront, when you're training a model, the way that you collect the data sets, this data set collection schema, it would be heavily informed how you're recruiting your eventual clinical trial recruits, right? It will be informing inclusion criteria. You have to define certain subgroup, the way that you define certain treatment arms, define a statistical analysis, inferior inferior performance, or any other measure that you're trying to achieve, right? So there will be multiple consideration that you have to think about during a VMV. And lastly, post-market monitoring is critical. Like I said just now, the model will degrade over time because of the distribution differences of the inference data. So it is absolutely critical to keep collecting information, after device deployment. And this information will help the sponsor to characterize the uncertainty of the device output, and obviously use predetermined change control plan as a measure to configure and calibrate the device regularly. Okay. All right, next slide, please. So what are the benefits? What are the benefits of early VMV planning? Okay. And obviously, avoid redesign, avoid retesting. It's the top priority, right? Because these would deplete your resources, and these will always, kind of quadruple the time that you need to go through the design control processes, right? And it's always going to be hard to demonstrate compliance when you are introducing certain significant redesign or retesting. And risk mitigation measure can also be pertaining to the labeling strategy and transparency to users, right? So we cannot emphasize, enough about involving human factor testing and user testing, and really think about how that would be impacting your VMV, early on, right? In one of example that the FDA guidance state, it's the reader study, right? We're talking about repeatability and reproducibility of certain device performance. How would a user or different user use the device at different time point? We impacted the result of the device output might be impacted by those use scenarios, right? And that's not obviously that's relevant to the clinical endpoints that we're trying to achieve, but you have to think along that line before you start conducting clinical trials, right? And the later benefit is you would like to avoid, right, the late stage failure. When you're moving your device realization process all the way to the later stage, the delay approval or significant increase in expenses is going to be it's going to be a killer for a lot of operation, right? So to understand the coherency across the VMV and the clinical trial planning and the execution part of it is actually very crucial and particularly relevant to the the AI-enabled devices. Okay. Right, next slide, please. So let's look at some references that inform the sponsor on the FDA requirement. Okay. GMLP guiding principle, is a joint effort across multiple regulatory bodies such as FDA, Health Canada, MHRA, and it does serve as a foundation for many regulatory bodies to build their respective local AI guidances for med device development, right? Transparency is a very important concept. And, we are really repeating ourselves or reiterating the importance of this because various type of user might interpret the output differently for their respective clinical task across the care continuum, right? So you have to demonstrate their respective clinical rules, their qualification, and the level of type of training they're expected to have and receive. It's absolutely critical to define and convince the FDA and convince the sponsor themselves that these interpretation of results, it's what you intended to demonstrate as a device output, right? And the PCCP, obviously, it addresses the issue with the calibration and configuration, right? So let's briefly talk about calibration configuration. Many client ask us about that question, okay? Calibration, calibration is really about ensuring the predicted probability of the device and the confidence score, that's showing in the device really reflect accurately the truly likelihood of the event, right? And configuration, involves the activity to optimize the model performance. So in a way, calibration is a kind of a post-deployment activity that you have to do regularly, and configuration have to be done when there's the model performance compromise, right? And let's take CAD devices as an example, right? Configuration can be as simple as a visualization element that can be turned on and off to help users to understand the model better, right? Such as the overlay of information, quality indicators, alert thresholds or heat maps, etc. So they can understand how the model is behaving through this metadata or contextual data, right? And this is really relevant to PCCP because you can introduce performance enhancement measure and retrain the model and maintain the model performance by adjusting parameters or hyperparameters, right? So there are multiple things that we're talking about here. One is calibrating the model. One is about configuring a model. And the way that you can do it is to embed a lot of these predetermined change control areas and the approach in your PCCP plan. Right? And the most recent draft guidance on the AI-enabled device software function is absolutely a must-read for a manufacturer. And we highly recommend all function, including your engineering team, your product team, your regulatory team, quality team, to review altogether this guidance, because this is a guaranteed cross-functional effort. Okay, next slide, please. So we're just gonna dig into a case study real quick, and and I'll pass on to Art to talk about the nuts and bolts for preparing and executing a successful clinical trial. Okay. So here is the device that we supported. Is the AI-enabled software for localizing a nerve before nerve block procedures using our ultrasound system, right? And obviously, we have to deploy a software that allow this segmentation to be effective on top of the general purpose ultrasound imaging system that they have built, right? And we leveraged FDA pre-submission to remediate a lot of this deficiencies that we identified upfront when we initially conducted a gap analysis for our clients, and we put together various validation proposals, and we helped them put together the exploratory test results to convince the FDA, one way or the other, to first inform the performance validation criteria, the recruitment strategy, and the later clinical performance criteria as well, right? So some area that we talked about, statistical consideration for sample size and data set per site, data set use cases for training and testing to avoid biases, variability across different subgroups, qualification of errors of users. We have to develop certain training plan and qualification plan for different type of users. And how do we address the real world condition in terms of the patient variability, etc. Right? So the eventual outcome is a effective planning for algorithm accuracy study, internal validation study, reader study, and external clinical validation study. So next slide, please. I cannot emphasize the importance of looking at the GMLP processes, right, to remediate the gaps during VMV. I won't dig into it because we already talked a lot about the factors that it's uniquely challenging for AI solutions. But we'd just like to emphasize that GMLP is a process that you can rely on, right, to remediate the gaps during VMV before clinical trial is initially kicked off. And to ensure the processes are optimized to support, the AI devices throughout the life cycle, from the initial the development testing to data, even earlier, right, to data collection, to model training, to model validation, to integrating your AI solution to your heuristic code base, to eventually deployment and maintenance, right, through the PCCP, through the post-market surveillance activity, right? And obviously, it's very, very important to think about how the post-market customer feedback is informing the performance of a certain non-conforming behaviors of your product, right? At the end of the day, your marketing claim would dictate what you need to do during VMV and clinical validation. And we consider GMLP as absolutely critical, paramount important to the SDLC process by 6304 process. So you have to think about the continuity of these activity as early as possible. Okay. So in the second half of the presentation, Art, the president of TAMM, will get into the nuts and bolts for preparing the execution of a successful clinical trial, right? Art, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Right.
So we're going to talk about clinical trials, which is a little different than model training that you might do using biobank data or even usability trials. Andrew talked about human factor testing and usability trials briefly. Those are human subject trials, but they are much smaller and very specialized. So if that's required, It's not going to be the focus of what I'm going to be discussing. GCP, good clinical practices. Any clinical trial that FDA is considering or that might be published should be conducted under GCP. And there are a number of guidance documents that you can reference for this. This applies to all clinical investigations involving human subjects in the United States. So investigational devices, informed consent, IRB, and of course, electronic records. There are guidances on these to make sure that the data is collected in a compliant manner and that human subjects are protected. The number one concern is always the safety of the patients involved. I don't know how to advance slides, so can I do that? So 3 major moving parts for clinical trials are timing, site selection, and of course, budget. Let's get into those. Timing, be realistic. Your clinical trial design and protocol is going to be impacted by a number of factors, including power. How large a patient population are you going to need to recruit to prove whatever your hypothesis is? And as such, you could be looking at anywhere, from a small cohort to 10,000 patients. We recently completed a trial for cardiac diagnostic wearable that involved that many patients to really demonstrate efficacy to the FDA. Conversely, we've done many IVD trials, which are a bit smaller. Contracting, this takes time. Contracting with each site, contracting with facilities if you have to, contracting if you're dealing with an IVD with any lab that might be testing, performing any part of the trial. IDE, that's a consideration for any device that is not minimal risk. If it's moderate or high risk device, which could be an IVD, possibly a non-IVD device, then you're going to need an investigational device exemption from the FDA before conducting the research with human subjects in the United States. Unexpected pandemics, other things arise. This impacted some of our trials, and you can't always anticipate everything that's going to happen. That goes back to being realistic. Yes, we would love to have everything done as fast as humanly possible, but and it always is, but you need to be able to manage those expectations a little bit. Sometimes there'll be underperforming sites. There will, you'll say, oh, I really want to use Dr. Smith. They are just the guru of all things with our device. I'll be honest, sometimes what we do as a standard operating procedure is we will review sites' performance before enrolling in the trial. And we will give you that feedback because we can look at how they performed in other clinical trials. And frequently, some of the thought leaders, especially if they're in an academic institution, may be involved in multiple clinical trials. Well, that may reduce their ability to recruit for your clinical trial. And so it's important to understand that if you want them involved, we can figure out a way to do that. But we need people that will drive, will really be the horsepower behind patient recruitment and completion. And then you want to consider all your audiences. FDA is one audience. But if you're going to spend the resources to conduct a good clinical trial, then you want to consider your future commercialization, your marketing, and that includes reimbursement or market access considerations. So by designing a clinical trial to address those audience needs, you don't have to repeat it later. And if you happen to be a smaller company that's looking to be acquired later, these are types of considerations that look very good to strategic partners. And this includes adding health economics and thinking about that early and often. So next slide. Site selection. I've alluded to this briefly, but experience. We must have somebody on site, point of contact, that actually has conducted clinical trials before. If that person doesn't exist, it's not going to go well. We need someone that's going to be recruiting the patients, identifying them from whatever method is available in that site, as well as screening them, and then really making sure they're recruited and complete the trial. And that involves some feet on the ground. Doctor involvement may or may not be that critical. It depends on your AI device and where is the place of service, the place of performance for your device. Is this going to require any sort of remote patient monitoring or chronic care monitoring? So I mentioned recruitment. Many of, whoops, a little bit anxious there. Okay. So many of the networks that we work with will have databases of patients that they can pull and review quickly to identify patients who might meet your inclusion or exclusion criteria, and then invite that subject in to see if they would like to participate. What's the volume? If they don't see enough of the types of patients that you're trying to recruit, then that site is not eligible. That is not a good decision. And then, as Andrew mentioned earlier, the subject diversity. Now, in this case, whenever we're talking about FDA requirements for diversity, they're looking for whatever your intended and indication for use are, that the patient population that you're intending your device to be used in, your diagnostic, AI, or otherwise, that your clinical trial reflects that patient population. So that doesn't necessarily mean, it means that whatever that population is by age or demographics, that it should be reflected in your clinical trial or trials, as the case may be. Go ahead now. So recruitment, site databases we just mentioned, site management. Oh, I changed this, but it's not here. Anyway, site networks of sites. How prevalent is this condition? Is this going to require a lot more sites to recruit that number of patients? If it's a very common condition, you can get dozens of patients out of every site. If it's a rare condition, then you're going to need a lot of sites to get those patients enrolled. IRB approved advertisements, and then appropriate compensation for time or travel. You cannot pay patients to participate, but you can reimburse them for their time and trouble. And that's, it just depends on how much is involved on their part. Next slide. So what required for an IDE? Non-significant risk device studies typically don't require this, but any sort of significant risk does. Or they can pursue an abbreviated IDE as appropriate. Whoever you're working with for regulatory can guide you on this. Significant risk device study requires a full IDE from the FDA. And that's a pre-IDE or an IDE submission. They have to respond within about 30 days. If they don't, you are allowed to go and start your trial. We recommend waiting for FDA feedback because the reality is this serves as a pre-submission in a way. It is considered that. And by considering their feedback to your IDE submission and incorporating that in your trial, when you make your eventual pre-marketing submission, they're going to be more receptive. If you ignore their feedback because they gave it to you on day 40 instead of day 28 or something, then you know they're going to notice that as well. And here's some exemptions listed on the slide for devices that don't need AI or otherwise any IDE. Next slide. Now, this is something that many smaller and emerging companies may not realize. If your device is going to be used in a Medicare-aged population at all, and it has received an FDA IDE, then you can pursue coverage with CMS. And so all Medicare covers the usual and routine services and supplies for any clinical trial. And that should not be part of your budget regardless. Your site should be able to report and get paid for any sort of standard of care. But if you get an approved clinical trial, they can also report and get paid for the use of your AI diagnostic during the conduct of the clinical trial. And this would be something that you would send an invoice to the site and they would pay directly. And we recommend highly that you consider whatever your commercialization price to be. Don't have any special pricing during the clinical trial, because this is going to serve as the baseline prior to commercialization. 70% of commercial payers, if you get this approval from CMS, which is not terribly difficult to do, 70% of commercial players like United Healthcare mirror their policy, meaning they will cover the device as well as standard of care and any routine services. You will need a clinical trial agreement, a CTA, that is specific for a reimbursed clinical trial. I will tell you, not all lawyers have any clue about how to write these. So, make sure you pick one that does. And then the benefits, there are many benefits of this, but one of them is when you go to market or even prior to approval, you can reach out to some payers because they are not providers. Okay, keep in mind, FDA regulates your activities regarding marketing to providers mostly. But you can reach out to plans and you will already have explanations of benefit, demonstrating that that plan has paid for your device during the trial and it was used by one of their providers with one of their patients. That conversation from a market access standpoint is dramatically different than, I have a new widget, let me tell you about it. So, next slide. Pre-trial prep. This is critical. So of course, you've got your protocol, you've had it appropriately powered, you've considered health economics, and you've incorporated those, so you're collecting that data. And that's critical because healthcare economics is very inexpensive to collect the data. It's very inexpensive to plan the trial to do that. It's incredibly expensive to recreate afterwards, oftentimes requiring another trial. Principal investigator site selection is pretty obvious. Budget and constraints. What is your budget? Is this going to be reimbursed? Does that change things? If it's an IDE approved by CMS clinical trial, you may be able to recruit more patients and make a much more powerful argument. You might be able to have a longer follow-up. And when we're thinking about that protocol, again, think about your different audiences. Let's say you have a sensor. We've worked with so many of these. Let me think for heart failure, for example. And your initial outcome is actually something that you can achieve within 3 to 6 months. So that might be your primary outcome for FDA clearance as a de novo, for example. But for the payers, they want to see that the results of whatever you're doing are persistent, that the effects or the impact on that patient are durable. So think about maybe a year-long follow-up. It could be something as simple as following up by phone. And you can design your protocol to have that interim analysis to meet FDA requirements. You can publish at that point and then have this ongoing trial that may continue post-marketing for that 12-month or longer follow-up. Just one example. IRB submission, so that's your institutional review board, giving you permission to use their subjects, basically, wherever you are. Electronic data capture, and site visits. Now, the other thing that you may think about is, who are you partnering with? When you're thinking about that site selection, if you happen to be working with a healthcare system of some sort, they oftentimes will have very large databases of their patients. And they might even have longitudinal data on how those patients have performed. If that data is something in their system and you could use it, then you might use that as a case control comparator or a retrospective comparator to your prospective trial. And that can be quite useful in proving the power of your overall design and outcomes. One other thing you're going to have to think about for an IVD, well, many things, but big one is sample collection and transport. How is that going to happen? Is it coming to your lab? It has to be done under GCP. And exactly how are you going to validate and verify that the samples you're getting are usable? Are the cells still viable? Are they still whole? Have they been damaged, either through phlebotomy or some other action? So those types of considerations are somewhat unique to IVD trials and can be quite cumbersome. So they need to be considered early. One other thing, just as an FYI, since we are talking about IVDs, which may incorporate AI, Texas vacated the recent LDT rule from last year from the FDA. So LDTs are allowed now, and it can be a good pathway to an eventual IVD submission to FDA and a way to generate revenue. You can get IVD codes from the AMA as soon as you are ready to commercialize or have, actually they changed the rules in the last CPT. So you will need to have a documented bill that you've sent out to someone. Anyway, important to understand. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Top priority, safety of subjects. Mentioned that earlier. Maintaining site management, monitoring communication, monitoring remotely data whenever possible. And there are lots of systems that allow that nowadays. And then, of course, sample collection, which I mentioned. These are all what's going on as you're trudging through and collecting that data. Go ahead. And then finally, you have study closeout. Now, Andrew mentioned a great example. Please have your algorithm locked down before the trial begins. We have a company that used a laser spectroscopy for a diagnostic. And unfortunately, they decided to change the algorithm for it during their clinical trial that was IRB approved and IDE approved. And the FDA said it's not the same device anymore. And they would not, and that product has been struggling for over a decade now, and they still don't have FDA clearance. So please have that locked down, and if you change it later, fine, come out with version 2, come out with a new and improved version. But for whatever you're doing for FDA, stick to the current. All right, so close out, final queries, database lockdown. Notify the IRB of the completion of the enrollment and recruitment and research on the subjects. Assure the subject safety. Prepare a final report. Oh my goodness, there are so many of these that aren't done. I don't know why. When you conduct a clinical trial, you need to write a clinical report, whether you're using a CRO or not. And by the way, CROs would, handle all of this, like us. You want that. FDA is going to be looking for it in your submission. Also, write a manuscript for publication. Whatever it is, if it's positive especially, get it out there in a peer-reviewed journal. Next slide. I mentioned health economic outcomes research and how you can incorporate this. There are several main types, including budget impact models, cost effectiveness, which would compare two things, your therapy to whatever standard of care is. This also impacts what is your protocol look like? What does your protocol look like? Make sure to think about standard of care. That's what every payer is going to compare you to. Whatever's currently done, how are you impacting it? Are you increasing cost, et cetera? I see Jaclyn, so I think we must be near the Q&A section. And here are some considerations. Who's your audience? What population are you treating? What is the impact of the therapy? What are the alternatives? Again, that standard of care. Next slide. Good. I think it's pretty close.
All right. Thank you, Andrew and Arthur, for the great presentation and for sharing such great insights on preparing an AI diagnostic device for a clinical trial. As we all know, and you guys saw today, there is a lot that goes into preparing for a clinical trial, and then between that and then the complex nature of just AI-enabled devices, We hope that you did find this information both valuable and easy to understand. And in addition, if you do need any assistance in determining what approach to take for your V&V testing or preparing your V&V activities for in compliance with FDA requirements, then please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@rookqs.com. Or if you're preparing for a clinical trial and are not really sure where to begin or need help executing it, look to a CRO like TAMNet, and you can reach out to them at info@tamnet.com. Otherwise, we'll jump into the Q&A session. Let's see. Okay. So, Arthur, this would be geared towards you. What are the common pitfalls for designing a clinical trial that you typically see?
Absolutely. I think we addressed some of those during the talk, but one of them is not considering all your audiences, not powering it appropriately. Now, the nice thing about, can we get away with 34 patients? Well, you can do whatever you want, but will anybody read it or care about it? So, one of those things that helps is thinking and getting that Medicare approval, CMS approval, which might lower your cost per patient and thereby allow you to recruit many more patients. Another pitfall is not getting your algorithm clamped down early. And then relying too much on one site is another one. People get excited because they have a clinical, maybe there's somebody on their scientific advisory board or whatever, and they're such a great advocate, they're a great cheerleader, but they may or may not be a great clinical site. They may not actually recruit the patients you need to get that trial completed.
Right.
So, it sort of falls under the trust but verify category. And then trying to do too much in a trial. Can we do a usability trial while we're doing our clinical trial? Can you? Maybe. Yeah, it might be better just to do the usability trial with your 8 patients or whatever in a lab where they do usability trials and then conduct the clinical trial separately. And then last but not least, think about where your data is going to go after the clinical trial. Patients, when they consent, are basically giving up their rights to privacy. So you're not very, at a high risk with that, believe it or not. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's the way it works. But commercialization, if you're collecting any sort of protected health information, you need to collect it in a HIPAA compliant and preferably SOC 2 compliant environment. So those are some things to think about. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you for touching on that. Okay, one more question. How do you implement a CR 34971 in conjunction with ISO 14971?
Fundamentally, 34971 is it's a standard or guidance, it's instruction to help sponsors to implement 4971 effectively on AI ML devices. And if you think about how we typically conduct risk management activity, and the challenges would be obvious here during the implementation process is the qualification of the evaluators here, right? Understanding a SAMD without ML and understanding SAMD with ML is a different skill set, different knowledge base, right? If we talk about failure mode, root cause of certain failure modes, are the assessor really qualified to give a comprehensive assessment on how to do it, right? There are unique and elevated challenges, we talk about a lot, data management, right? Training, evaluation across different subgroups, cybersecurity, information security, which, Art mentioned multiple times throughout the presentation, right? So really at a high level, I think you got to make sure that whoever is conducting risk management activity are qualified. They understand how a AI ML device works and being developed, what are the potential challenges for integrating these into the clinical workflow so they can also consider the clinical oriented or user oriented risk for these type of devices on top of the design aspect, right? So this can get super complex very fast. And we also found it quite challenging because, every product, every AI devices differs quite a bit. The way it's being developed, the way it's being, evaluated. So in a nutshell, you just have to allocate it more time to really think about how the AI ML devices should be subjected to and how it should be subjected to risk management activity. And I think the top, barrier oftentimes is actually having a qualified team to do this cross-functionally.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. And Arthur, that kind of sounds similar to what you've said about the importance of, or I guess not the importance, but how valuable a CRO can be in, executing and preparing for a clinical trial. What do you think is one of the big things, or what do you see when clients come to you needing, CRO services? What are typically the challenges they're facing?
There's a variety of them. There are obviously much larger CROs in the world than TAMNet. We are a boutique service. What the heck does that mean? It means that we generally are going to be dealing with trials that are US based. We aren't going to have a team of people in every country around the world. We have a couple OUS folks, but generally we're going to be in the US. But the other thing that means, and they've faced this, some of our clients have faced this, they've worked with one of these larger CROs, and they're dealing with regulatory, they're dealing with the clinical trial, and generally those are the only two areas most CROs work with. We happen to bring in market access, which we think is critical to consider early. But so in the process of working with them, they get their team changes every 6 months. And here they are, a small company, and every 6 months they've got to retrain whoever their project manager is and maybe some other key people on their team. That's an incredible burden. In our case, again, what does that mean? It means that you're assigned somebody. We make sure that everybody's communicating and happy, feels very comfortable with the quality of folks they're working with. And that's it. You don't have anybody changing every 6 months, causing disruption in your own internal processes as you're worried about your, Series B or whatever else is going on in your company. So anyway, what was the other part of the question, Jaclyn?
Oh, I was just asking, like, what are typically the reasons, or I guess the challenges that clients are facing when they come to you approaching?
So the other one is they generally wouldn't know what good clinical practices are. They wouldn't know how to really evaluate sites. And the nice thing, again, dealing with a smaller firm is we can fill in as needed. If you have a wonderful clinical lead, maybe you even have an outline of a protocol, we can finish that and then work with you to edit it. If you have sites identified, we can at least evaluate them and say, okay, yeah, these couple sites are great. I don't recommend this one for whatever reason. And we can go through that with you. Just a lot more flexibility to serve. If you have a biostat group you love, fine, we won't use ours. If you don't, we have incredibly qualified folks. So those are some of the ways that you work with them. And then you don't want conflict. If you're running this clinical trial by yourself, that's generally considered a conflict of interest.
Right.
So even though you're hiring the CRO, they are acting as a sponsor representative. That is acceptable and considered third-party arm's length activities.
Okay.
That helps a little.
Yeah, no, that does. Thank you. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I guess we can call it quits. So thank you all for your time, and thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Andrew, for the great presentation.
The other thing is I'm sorry, I was thinking about the other benefits of a CRO. We're negotiating with the sites. We've done this before. You may not realize what the range of pricing is for each activity or how to get them to sign a protocol. Yeah, oftentimes we're going back to sites that we've used for 3 or 4 different clinical trials. So one, they respond very quickly. We can get the trial up and running quickly. And 2, we know what's to be expected for cost. And that can save significantly on conduct of the trial.
Okay, good to know. No, no
Yeah,
problem.
thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. And once again, thank you, Art, and thank you, Andrew. All right. And as a reminder, I will send out the recording and the slide deck later this afternoon. All right. Have a good one, guys.